The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. Trade negotiations between the U.S. and China have entered a second day as officials from both countries seek to ease growing tensions surrounding technology exports and the supply of rare earth elements. U.S. officials have indicated a possible willingness to roll back recent restrictions on high-tech exports in return for China loosening its grip on critical rare earth shipments. U.S. President Donald Trump noted China's not easy, yet signs of progress appear to be emerging. But China has remained mostly silent post-first day of talks. So what's really at play behind these high-level talks? What does each side stand to gain or lose in this negotiation? Well, joining us today to share more is Chris Humphrey, who's Executive Director of EU-ASEAN Business Council. Hi, Chris. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much for joining us. Well, Chris, trade talks between China and the U.S. have stretched into the second day in London with a focus on rare earths, export controls, and semiconductor restrictions. Now, the U.S. has called the discussions fruitful, though the outcome remains uncertain. What would you say are the core goals each side is hoping to achieve this time around? I mean, are we talking tactical gains or something more long-term and strategic?
I think one thing's absolutely clear. This is not a traditional trade discussion, negotiation. This is very much focused on the elements you just mentioned, particularly rare earths, and then access for China to U.S. high tech. And it's therefore much more of a mercantilist approach that both sides are taking. So whilst in the background we have the whole tariff story and those ridiculously high tariffs that both sides are seeking to impose on each other, this discussion is about how can we make progress on these two niche areas. Now, I think for the U.S., of course, access to the rare earths is very, very important. It's important for things like electric vehicles, for magnets, and for other high-tech stuff. China obviously wants access to high-end semiconductors and technology. There's its own drive on things like AI development, of course, going forward. I think at the end of the day, they will have to reach some compromise with each other because neither side, and indeed the rest of the world, wants to see a return to those 145%, 132% tariffs.
But what might have been the reason why the talks have been stretched into another day?
Well, I think these are very difficult issues. Both sides are a bit wary of each other. Chinese, of course, are playing a much cooler game, less public than the Americans are playing. But of course, the Chinese are very wary that any deal done today could fall apart tomorrow. So I think they both want to be sure that they have an outcome and an outcome that can be done not just with that much talked about handshake, but a deal that can last time.
Well, Beijing, on the other hand, has kept a low profile here, offering no public commentary after day one as compared to the U.S. So, Chris, what might Beijing's silence mean? Do you see this as a negotiation tactic or uncertainty on how far they're willing to go with these prolonged talks?
I think it's a bit of both, to be quite honest with you. China tends to play a much more patient, long-term game than the Americans do. The Americans are looking for short-term wins at the moment. If only just Donald Trump can say to his support base, look what I'm doing. Chinese, I think, will be much more patient. They will look longer term. And it's not their nature, actually, to go shouting about how negotiations are going until those negotiations have been concluded.
Well, these talks also follow the preliminary trade deal reached in Geneva last month. How do this week's meetings build on that deal?
Well, they're coming at a time, of course, when the Trump administration are accusing China of breaching that deal. Although China is beginning to relax on the export restrictions on rare earths and they've been issuing licenses. And that's really why these talks are happening now. They're trying to build from Geneva, make sure that original deal, which had the pause and those very high tariffs, does not fall apart completely, and see if they can reach some kind of compromise on these key elements.
Right. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, rare earths seem to be the front and center of these discussions between China and the U.S. Why are these materials so strategically important geopolitically? I mean, what makes them such powerful leverage for China in negotiations like this?
Well, China, of course, has a huge number of reserves for these rare earth elements, and they actually corner the market for it at the moment. They're used in a whole range of things, whether it's parts for EVs and the magnets that go inside them, whether it's for high-end defense systems, whether it's for new technology, perhaps mobile phones, and for AI as well. They're all vital for these sort of things that are technologically advanced. And that's why it's key, and that's why China holds such sway. And you've seen China recently talk about opening up a green channel, as they call it, for exporting these to Europe. That's clearly part of the bargaining pitch with the US. We're going to be kind to other people who are being kind to us. but we're going to hold them back from you unless you start being nicer to us at the same time. It's only natural. And, whilst they do exist in other places in the world, they're not always very accessible. Part of the deal, the minerals deal with Ukraine and the US, was so the US can get access to some of the rare earths that are in Ukraine, but also they're not accessible.
Yeah, China controls nearly 70% of the world's rare earth production. So, Chris, how might the U.S. then mitigate that dependency, and what's likely to come up in negotiations?
Mitigating the dependency is difficult. They obviously need access to the production of rare earth elements from China in the short term and the medium term. Longer term, well, we've already had Trump talk about things like the US needs Greenland, for instance, because he believes that Greenland has large deposits of the rare earth elements. There are other places you can get them from. Australia has some, as mentioned, Ukraine already, but none of these are quick return locations.
Now, the U.S. is reportedly considering easing some of its tech export controls in exchange for greater access to Chinese rare earths. But Trump remained, non-committal about lifting the curbs on high-end AI chips. How significant do you think a partial easing of exports be, particularly for industries heavily reliant on semiconductors and advanced tech?
Well, this is, I guess, the billion-dollar question in all of this. How much does Trump want to give away? How much does he want to keep back to protect the development of AI technology within the US and stop the Chinese marching ahead? Now, he's got to be able to give something away in order to get the access to the rare earth elements that he's really desperate to get hold of for the US industry. And it's going to be a fine balancing act for him. He can't give away the crown jewels, so to speak.
The U.S. has made it clear that some export controls might be lifted, but not on the most advanced NVIDIA chips. Is there any messaging here on selective easing? How does it fit into that broader tech rivalry and security concerns surrounding AI in China?
There is big rivalry, as you just mentioned. We've had Chinese AI applications stealing a march on things like OpenAI and ChatGPT from the US. And that's what they're going to be very mindful of. That is why I don't believe they will ease the export restrictions on those NVIDIA chips that you just mentioned, but they might ease it in some other areas. China won't get everything it wants from these negotiations, but equally the US won't get everything it wants from these negotiations. So eventually there's going to have to be some compromise on both sides.
Meanwhile, in Geneva last month, both sides, as you mentioned, agreed to pause tariff hikes for 90 days, less than a fiscal quarter. Yet trade volumes, they have continued to fall, especially in May. Now, exports from China to the U.S. dropped significantly, while U.S. imports to China were also down nearly 20%. So, Chris, what do these figures say about the effectiveness of these interim deals? Is it more of a political fix than a policy solution?
It's definitely not a policy solution, that's for sure. I think it says two things. One, there's a time lag. It takes companies time to react to the pause that's happening. You've got to manufacture things and then start shipping things. So there's a time lag in those export numbers that you just mentioned. So I would expect, I think, for this month, you will see a pickup in the exports from China to the US and vice versa. Whilst the pause is still in place, companies will be rushing to get products out the countries into the other country during this month of June, as we now talking. The problem is, of course, how reliable is the US position on tariffs, because we've seen Donald Trump and his team put tariffs up, pause them, put them down, put them back again over the course of this year. The UK did a deal with the US that got 0% on steel and aluminium, only for Donald Trump 2 weeks later to say, I'm adding 25% to existing tariffs, and that 25% of course has been added to the UK.
Right.
How can you trust a deal when you think you got a deal?
Yeah, makes sense. Well, given that this is another round of trade talks between the U.S. and China, do you view this as a time for reset or to access the limitations of the interim deals?
I view it as an opportunity for both sides to calm down and not ruin the global economy, to be quite frank with you. We don't need a return to those very high levels of tariffs. 30% and 10%, which are currently in place, are already high enough and difficult for businesses to deal with, and will cost the consumers on both sides. I hope the outcome of these talks is some kind of sensible conclusion to both sides, one they can live with and one that will stand the test of time.
Well, before we let you go here, Chris, what will happen if talks then do not end on a good note this time round? Will talks be extended, or even worse, could we see more tariffs implemented on one another?
Well, I think the worst case scenario is the current pause is removed and we head back to 145% tariffs on Chinese goods into the US and 130 odd of US goods into China. That's the worst case scenario. I guess if they can't reach a conclusion today, they may well extend it into a third day in London whilst they're there, or they may agree to go away and come back again in a week or 2 weeks' time whilst keeping the pause in place. What's the best outcome is there's a deal.
Some great insights from you there. Thank you so much, Chris, for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. That was Chris Humphrey, who is the Executive Director of EU-ASEAN Business Council. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.